So welcome everyone in this strangely configured room. And hello to those who are online. Can you hear us all right?
Yes.
Wonderful. So I'd like to welcome you all to this briefing on H2H. And we might have a few stragglers as they look for the room in this labyrinth of a building. So H2H, humanitarian to humanitarian. For those who are not yet familiar with it, akin to B2B in the private sector, and Kim will tell you more about that in a minute. Maybe I should just start by asking, how many of you are familiar already with H2H? Okay, and how many of you have never heard of it? Okay. Good, so we know where we stand. My name is Hiba Ali. I'm the CEO of the New Humanitarian, which is a nonprofit news organization that reports about humanitarian crises and aid policy. And we are a member of the H2H Network. I'm also the chair of its board of directors, and I'm here in that capacity today. Well, I've long been interested in H2H, in the concept, and I looked up the date this morning. It's been 3 years now, almost, that I've been the board chair. In a funny happenstance of events, but I agreed to do so because I think the network is very much aligned with what we try to contribute to at the New Humanitarian, which is more effective and accountable humanitarian action. And while many of the organizations that are members of the network may be invisible, I think we really hit above our weight, a punch above our weight in terms of the impact that we have in improving humanitarian response. So that's been my motivator or driver in being involved in all this. And it's also very much fun for those of you who are at our reception last evening to be involved with this agile entrepreneurial team. So it's been a great pleasure also to work with the small but dynamic H2H team. So today we have a few goals in mind. We're hoping you can come away from this session with, first, for those of you who don't know what H2H is, an understanding of what it is, what it does. For those of you who are familiar with it, an understanding of how it has evolved since it launched officially in 2018. And then for those of you who are ready to engage a little bit more deeply, how you can engage with the network, either as an aid agency that benefits from its services, as a prospective member, or as a donor. So you'll hear from its new leadership, you'll hear from its founding donor, you'll hear from a few members, and hopefully we'll have a good chunk of time for questions and discussion. So maybe before I start, just to get a better sense of who is in the room at a more detailed level, how many of you are already members of H2H? Okay, and prospective members are interested, okay. Aid agencies? All right, and donors? And online as well, I think. Okay, great, that's helpful. Have I missed anyone? No. Yes?
Yes, NGO networks.
NGO networks, thank you. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to kick things off by introducing you to Kim Scriven, who is H2H's new executive director. Many of you will know him from his past, but I will first just kind of give you, H2H has been through quite an evolution. It was created informally at the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016, got its first funding and its official launch in 2018, and had, over the course of those years, many different people contributing to its launch, its initial startup phase. And last year, the board felt that it was important for the organization to have longer term leadership. And after a comprehensive search, I can say we were quite unanimous in feeling that Kim was the perfect person to take H2H into this new era. It's a time when H2H is becoming more relevant, its services more in demand, it's increasing its membership and its funding, and very fitting, I think, that we now have an entrepreneurial fund manager who has experience in humanitarian innovation at its helm. So Kim, for those of you who don't know, spent years working in innovation at ALNAP. He managed the Humanitarian Innovation Fund at ELRA. Most recently, he was the manager of a new funding mechanism established by ICRC and IFRC to develop the capacity of national societies. And now he is our new and courageous leader who for me really symbolizes new momentum and a strong foundation for H2H moving forward. So Kim, over to you.
Thanks, Heather. That's too kind of you. Very nice. Thank you. As Heather already said, I'm going to stand up. The purpose of today for me is to hear a bit from the members about the work they do and to share on that, and also to talk about some of the plans that we have for the future coming up. But also, as Heather said, I have been in my post now for about 6 months. So that sort of should be the point when one moves from sort of learning and absorbing to be able to sort of think about what we want to do in the future. So I will talk about that, but before I want to go a little bit back to the beginning of H2H and reflect on how it's got to where it is at the moment. So it's about 6 years now, more since the World Humanitarian Summit, and it was on the sidelines of the WHS where the idea for H2H really came and began to concretize as a number of actors in the sector saw that they had this common role, providing services to the wider system, a part of the system, but not themselves directly delivering aid. And from that, it's become more formalized over the years. But it's a reasonable question to ask why that's necessary to go from this shared recognition to having a more formalized network. And I think one of the reasons is important to think about how change has and does happen in the system, because we have had many of these formal structured reform processes like the WHS, and they have led to change and improvement that I think has been really important and we should celebrate. But we also see that change happens at the edge of the system and in the spaces a little bit separate from some of the more institutionalized parts. And I would give examples after Rwanda and the system-wide evaluation that came about there, many of the accountability initiatives that emerged that became also H2H members later on, and also if you look perhaps after the Haiti earthquake and the emergence there of a lot of new approaches using data and information technologies and the process of consolidation and formalization after that, which led to many organizations forming and now making a really important part in the humanitarian system. If we look at the COVID response and now the ongoing response to Ukraine, we could also ask if those are the same sort of large epoch-defining emergencies for the sector. So far, COVID hasn't seemed to lead to that change. We thought that maybe it would really push forward the localization agenda, but perhaps that hasn't happened. And we're not sure yet what will be the impact of the Ukraine response and the fact that you've got people moving to countries where you do have strong civil society, you do have strong governance that are leading the response there. And I think that that might be because over the last 10 years, we've seen the formal system consolidate much more and larger amounts of resources going to a smaller number of operational agencies and UN agencies. And I think that should be really welcomed because it's led to greater coverage, it's led to greater efficiency, but it also presents challenges in terms of how you innovate, how you bring in new approaches and new ideas. And I think that that makes the H2H network and our members more relevant than ever. If we also fast forward now to what's happened to the H2H network over those years, it's seen a real growth in members. We have about just under 60 members now, and about half of those have accessed the H2H fund, and the fund itself, supported by FCDO, has been a really important part of allowing network members really to demonstrate their value in specific emergencies and support the overall response. Here we can see many of the members, the members that we have today. I'm sure everyone in the room is familiar with at least a dozen of these, if not more, and will be aware that these are some of the key initiatives driving change and improvement in the sector. I'm going to leave the details of the work that's been done through the fund to the members to speak through themselves, but I wanted just to mention a couple of facts and statistics from it. It's turned over about 5 million francs over its existence since 2019, which is not a huge amount of funding, and I think it's really important to see that quite a small amount of resources can have a really big impact across a number of emergencies by raising the overall quality of response and supporting the larger operational actors. That money's been split across 13 activations and supported 64 member projects, so with an average of about 80,000 francs per award. We did a session yesterday on COVID-19, and one of the things that struck me is that activation, the first COVID-19 activation we did, was about £400,000, supporting 4 of our members, but reached millions of people in India with the communications tools that BBC Media Action had. over 1,600 journalists were supported by the tools that Internews was developing, and that the tools that were produced were translated into 67 languages. So that reach from quite a small amount of money, I think, is really, really important. In terms of looking ahead then, we have our AGM tomorrow where we'll be going into more detail with this with the membership, but there are 3 areas that I really want to highlight as being important for the next stage of the network's development. The first of those goes back to that sort of original conversations at the WHS and that sense of community between the membership, because I think it's still there, but it's really important that we continue to foster that as the network grows, as we bring in new members, so that there is that real sense of the network working together, stimulating new forms of collaboration between and beyond the membership. So that means things like strengthening our governance, so there's a stronger role between, stronger link between the membership and the board. It means developing specific communities of practice around areas of interest for the membership, and it means developing new ways for them to collaborate and work together. The second area is around resourcing and the fund. I think what is important about the fund is it is lean, it's targeted, so that doesn't mean that exponential growth is a goal for us, but I do think that we can look to expand and broaden the donor base and expand the areas of emergencies where our members are supported through the fund, but also always looking at how we can make sure the resources that flow through the fund are value add and do build on that community that I've already described. And the final area is around facilitation and brokering, helping our members reach out from the network into the wider sector through other networks, through connections with operational agencies, and also importantly with bits of the humanitarian sector that may always not be recognised and given access to some of the formal structures there. So I'd be talking particularly about local actors in government and civil society, as well as perhaps business and other actors working in emergencies who could benefit from H2H tools but might not always have been able to access them. So I know we'll come back to this, but in terms of how people can engage there with the community side, we are looking for new strong organisations that can join us. We don't want to grow the membership at an unsustainable rate, and we've got to be careful about making sure that we can provide services and value to them. But I'm really keen to find the next H2H members that we can bring on board. In terms of resourcing, we do want to broaden the donor base and to bring on more donors to support the fund and to expand the work of the fund. And we do want to have that conversation with the other parts of the system to see how we can better link in our members to wider system conversations, both in the formal architecture and beyond. So I hope we can pick up on some of those today and beyond. So thanks a lot.
Maybe just before I let you go, Kim, we see on the screen the range of members, and you've said kind of what defines H2H is specialized agencies that are supporting improved humanitarian response overall rather than serving beneficiaries directly. But how do you break these members up into different categories, which is maybe helpful in getting more concrete about what?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think that one thing that's important before breaking them down is recognizing they're all humanitarian organizations. So by that we mean they're all principled, they're all recognizing the need for independent and partial humanitarian action. I think that that's important to underline something that unites them, and they're all through their work committed to providing what I would describe as sort of humanitarian public goods, so services, products, tools that support the whole sector rather than just individual parts of it. When we break down what some of those services and tools are, we do it into 4 areas. So the first is information management, data and analysis. The second is around community accountability and engagement. The third is around security, logistics and program support. And the final one is around sector quality and professionalisation.
I am going to break the rules and just take a couple of immediate questions for you, Kim, in reaction, and then we're going to go online to Matthew Sutters, who is with us from FCDO. So
I think we're having the same question. We don't see any UN agencies.
You don't see any UN agencies.
So you don't see, if you look at those organisations, they're typically not operational or formal system actors. So what these actors will do is support the UN system, support the big implementing INGOs to improve their response. So what we've seen is that they're increasingly delivering large-scale, vertically integrated responses. And what the services our members do is at different points in that value chain provide additional support, enabling a broader increase in the quality and impact of the wider response.
And so that's what I meant when I said off the top, akin to B2B in the private sector. So rather than B2C, where you're serving the consumers, you're actually serving the other humanitarian agencies to help them do their jobs better. We're providing, in our case, accountability over those agencies to ensure that the overall sector is benefited. Is that your question?
I mean, I thought it's BBC Media, but I see it's BBC Media Action, because I was just surprised how BBC can be a donor, but yeah. I mean, in terms of neutrality, yeah.
So BBC Media Action's a recipient of our fund. So
Okay, yeah.
the work I was talking about in COVID-19, what they were doing there is identifying misinformation that was being produced around the pandemic and the response to it, and then looking at how you could counter that specifically in a number of countries in Asia Pacific. So BBC Media Action is the charitable foundation of the BBC in the UK.
Okay, yeah, that no, I saw afterwards, actually, yeah. I didn't see from here.
Great. So you'll hear a little bit more about examples of what different members do in just a minute, and that might help crystallize a little bit the unique role that I think H2H organizations play. But first, I wanted to turn to the founding donor of the network. H2H has actually now moved on to, it started with one donor. It is now, knock on wood, getting a number of new funding prospects. We're in the midst of closing an agreement with BHA at USAID. But as CDO, previously DFID, was really the funder that had from the beginning a belief in this concept and a real kind of boost in getting it off the ground. So we thought it'd be great to hear from them. So I'm going to turn to Matthew Sutters, Deputy Head of the Conflict, Humanitarian and Security Department, known as CHASE at FCDO. Over to you, Matthew.
Thank you very much, and thank you to everybody online and in the room. I hope you've also got in the room my colleague Shanna, who will be able to join you for the whole of the meeting. I just wanted to say a few words really about how important H2H is to us. So, you know, I hope all of you, I'm sure, are aware of the history of H2H, kind of springing out of the World Humanitarian Summit and the overall desire to make humanitarian assistance as effective and straightforward as possible. And we've been proud to support H2H and the network since its inception as part of our Humanitarian Enablers program. You've heard in the interventions we've already had some descriptions of how H2H works and what H2H does. I mean, in my mind, if you consider the humanitarian system as a kind of giant super tanker, H2H is the high quality lubricating oil that makes it all better and makes it all possible. And the members of H2H do brilliant work in many, many different ways that improve the quality and even in some cases the feasibility of delivering humanitarian assistance. And you do so in a way that's also independent, which we need as well sometimes. So we've been delighted to fund H2H kind of since its inception. We've also been delighted with how H2H has evolved during that period and how it's grown and how there's now the fund as well to kind of help boost and support the organisations. We just would encourage organisations to keep being involved with H2H, to keep up with your excellent work, and we'd encourage other donors to consider supporting H2H's work too. It's absolutely vital for high quality, accountable, impartial, effective humanitarian aid that we have organisations as part of the H2H network that are able to deliver in the variety of ways that you are. I want to also, as part of a very brief intervention, just thank the DRC for hosting H2H from the beginning and for providing the home and the kind of governance and the supporting the network through the growing pains. And I just want to end on a pretty straightforward note, really. It won't surprise many of you that competition for resources when it comes to humanitarian is pretty high, and competition for UK resources is pretty high. We don't have the level of resources we used to have, and we consider investments in things like H2H things that are worth protecting because they're catalytic and multiplier, and they make all of the humanitarian assistance everywhere better. So I would encourage all of you to get involved and to really engage with H2H and all the partners, and end by thanking all of you for the great work you already do.
Thank you very much, Matthew. And I have noted down that quote, and I will use it repeatedly. If the humanitarian system is a super tanker, H2H is the high quality lubricator. I don't think I've ever heard lubricator used as a compliment before, so that's a great one. Thank you. Matthew's going to have to leave us, but as he said, Shauna is here in the room and she'll share a few thoughts a bit later. But first, we wanted to turn to some members, given this is a membership network, to hear a bit more about their work, to give you an idea concretely about what it means to be an H2H member and the benefit they have from the Secretariat or the team. But also a little bit more around kind of, it'll help you understand the diversity of members and the kinds of work that they do. We have alternatively been called not just lubricators, but service providers, positive deviants, change agents, and so you'll get a bit more of a flavor of what that looks like. So let me first call up Christina, the Executive Director of Insecurity Insight. And maybe you can also tell us a little bit on in those three kind of pillars that Kim laid out around what the network does for its members around the community side of things.
Thank you. So am I standing in the right place?
I think so, yeah.
Perfect. Okay. So hi, I'm Christina Villa. I'm from Insecurity Insight. We are a very small H2H organization who's specialized in what we refer to as data on people in danger. So we do various things from methods to the actual data collection, and we want to look at the security within the key sectors of the aid world: health, education and protection. And we want to have a conversation with the key aid providers in how we can actually think more about protecting people within these structures and what it means for the aid sector. So that's what we are, and that's our mission. I was at the first AGM when the H2H Network was founded, and I left the room really excited because I felt for the first time I was sort of in a room with lots of like-minded people who were driven by one very specific thing they were concerned about, or they had ideas about the aid sector, but tended to be a bit in their own corners and lived in their own worlds. And suddenly we were there in a room and we had a lot in common in terms of what our challenges were, and from anything structural, how you work when you're a very small organization, how do you deal with all sorts of things, from your cybersecurity to retaining your staff to various other things, to also the big question, how do we actually be the lubricant in the aid sector? So I want to say just a few words today from a very selfish perspective, because I want to share with you what the H2H Network has meant for us as an organization. For me, the H2H has sort of two big objectives. It is to help organizations like ours to be more efficient, and the other element is also to create the change within the aid system. So I'm really focusing today on the first part, because the second is a little bit harder to grapple with, but just to sort of throw in, H2H has also done an amazing work in thinking about meal structures, how we can actually identify the impact we're having, and we're currently carrying out an evaluation looking at that. But I'm going to talk about where I feel I actually really have the knowledge, because I can say what it means for me. So it was the AGM, the HNPW meeting just before the pandemic, where I was sort of chatting, had the opportunity to chat to people from the H2H network. And for the first time in my life, I was really talking to people from MAP Action. And it was literally a conversation. Hi, this is what we do, what you do. Oh, I see. Understanding something that another small organization was doing. That was all that happened at the H2H meeting. Then the pandemic happened, and we were, and I've just been talking about in a session just now, sort of documenting the attacks on healthcare in that context. And we then received some funding from FCDO through a very different channel that was focused on research on this, and we're putting the data together. And I was then following up on the conversation with Map Action to which is something we had just decided at the H2H meeting. Let's chat a bit more to better understand what we're doing. And suddenly we just had this idea where we could really collaborate. And if someone could sort of click on it, this is the outcome of it. So here we were getting our data, and I was struggling with an idea, how can I actually share that with a wider public? And then the Map Action people said, well, we can give you the programmers who can make your idea a reality. And that is the interactive map they created for us. And without going into the sort of technical details, it was just an amazing experience of being able to share very specific elements from two organizations and sort of bringing that together. And if you sort of click twice through it, you see it's an interactive map. So you can see here where the conflict events happened and where the COVID events happened. So that's sort of what we built there. It became for us a great tool to communicate what we were doing. And I think that to me is sort of the take-home message here. What does H2H bring? It brought us the ability to collaborate with another organization that I think really helped us to do more with what we were doing. And then if you click now on it, this is a sort of specific element of that map. So it's an interactive map. You can zoom in on a particular country, and then you sort of get your stats on that country from our data. And you can also click on these yellow blocks and then read individual incident descriptions. So this is what we've been doing since the pandemic. We've been updating this. But now if you click on it, there is another product that we're now doing with Map Action. And this is now the sort of the Ukraine data being put on a Map Action map, which Map Action sends out through the OCHA system. And what for me is so amazing about how this map came about was it was a 5-minute call now with people who didn't know each other that well, but we had this experience of collaborating that now as things had to be done quickly, it was just, yep, let's do it. That's how we do it. There was no discussion. Do we need MOUs? Do we need this or that frameworks? We just could just go out there and do it. So that's sort of my short story here of what H2H for us really meant. Meeting other people who can really help us make more with the stuff we are doing. And to sort of bring it to the bigger point, you know, how does that actually change the aid system? Well, I think there's in this map is also something for us, because with Map Action being the service provider within this response, it's the opportunity for us to get our information in there, and it's being sent out through the system. And that I think is the other great thing that H2H has facilitated from our perspective, giving us the vehicle to do that, literally being the lubricant, I guess, in the sense. So Map Action is our lubricant into the system. So yeah, I think I sort of close on this there. I could have also mentioned a couple of other organizations, but I think that's sort of what H2H to us really means, and it's been just very helpful for the actual product, but it's also just always a pleasure to meet colleagues and to sort of feel you're part of a community. So thank you for the H2H network, what you've done. And also I think for FCDO, if there hadn't been that sort of money put behind it, it also would have been much more difficult to really sort of do with it, because yeah, this also came out of the activations. So, but yeah.
Thank you so much. So there you've gotten a kind of insight into both one of the categories of H2H actors. So Insecurity Insights falls under the security, logistics, and program support category. And then also one of the added values of the network, which is really this community of organizations that can work together and communicate with one another. Now we'll show you a different slice. So I'm going to invite Meg to come up. Meg Sattler is the new executive director of Ground Truth Solutions, which is in the community engagement and accountability category. Not that these are mutually exclusive, but just to give you a sense of their richness, and who will tell us a little bit more, not only about ground truths, but also about accessing the H2H fund.
Yes, thank you. So for those of you who aren't familiar with ground truth, I think some of you probably are. Ground truth is basically a small, I called it a tiny organisation the other day and got in trouble from the team. So we're not tiny, we're just small. An organisation that was founded on the sort of premise that there was this huge gap in humanitarian monitoring, where anytime we looked at outcomes, we sort of never factored in community perspectives of how responses were going. So we basically now track perceptions in crisis situations using qualitative and quantitative methods to try and see if there's a way that we can sort of quantify community feedback and include that into monitoring metrics, and also use it as responses are being rolled out so that hopefully people can sort of respond to data in real time and make pivots based on community priorities. We are very passionate beneficiaries and supporters of H2H. I think sometimes, ground truth comes across as this like small, cool organisation who's sort of pushing change, and, I think we do good stuff, but often I think what people don't necessarily see from the outside is how incredibly difficult it is to operate as an organisation like that in the world of super tankers, to continue the metaphor. Something we really struggle with is funding. So we are funded sort of to an okay level, but we were talking about this the other day in the office, and we realised that on average for all of our donors, it takes us 2 years from asking a donor initially to receiving funding for the organisation. And so with H2H, it's not just a transactional thing. We're grateful that we get funding. It's about the timeliness of that funding. And we've realised that there's sort of a direct correlation between how quickly you can get funding and longer term impact. So sort of seeing it as this seed funding at a time when it's needed, when there's momentum for people to sort of really take what we're doing, act on our feedback. We need to really kind of strike when the iron's hot. And a place that has really worked of late has been Haiti. So in the Haiti activation, we were able to access funding really quickly. And that was at a time where the country team in Haiti had already requested us to start operating. Now that has happened recently in DRC. They requested us to start supporting them 2 years ago, and we spoke to a donor and we still haven't received that funding. Whereas with H2H, it was like a couple of weeks, I think. And so the project was sort of short, but what that meant was that because we were able to get in when all that energy was there, outcomes from that project, such as, country teams still following up on the feedback that we collected, sort of catalysing this culture of responding to feedback across the response, was really possible. And so that's something that we sort of can very rarely replicate with funding streams that actually aren't the H2H network. So we're very passionate about this network and its survival. And another thing I think is there are various types of organisations, but we are an organisation that's a bit of a pain. Like basically what we do is collect feedback on how people are doing in their response, and it's very rarely positive. And sometimes it's a challenge when you have to wait to be invited to do that, I suppose. And something about the H2H network has been, you don't necessarily need to be invited in through a call for proposals on a specific topic or because an HC wants you there. You're able to do what the sector should be doing, but quickly and at a time that it needs to be there. And then the third thing I'll touch on is this partnership element that was mentioned before. I think it's really useful when now as small organisations, another thing that we're getting from donors is like, there's all these small organisations now, and how are you collaborating and how do you sort of stand out and how do we make sure that you're not duplicating? And in a way, the H2H activations do a bit of that work for us because we have this matrix to see who's doing what. We're able to then respond quickly to country teams and say, we're doing this, they're doing that. We're kind of working together where it makes sense. We don't have to where it doesn't. In Haiti, we worked with the new humanitarian, and that was able to really take our project much further. We also sort of collaborated with a couple of other H2H organisations on training and a few things that are ongoing, sort of well beyond the activation has finished. So I'll stop there, but that's basically my passionate spiel about H2H.
And now we've added to the adjective list lubricant, but now pain also. If you're a pain to the system, you might be an H member. Great. I'm lastly going to invite, I say that because we're also a pain to the system and usually loved but hated.
Now we're being paid together, so it's even better.
So lastly, we're going to invite up Tyler Radford, who's the Executive Director of Humanitarian Openstreetmap. So again, another category of H2H member in the data and information management space. And who can also tell us a little bit, hopefully, about how your H2H is helping you kind of plug your services into the wider humanitarian architecture.
Definitely. I now have a challenge. I need to come up with a new
adjective, yes.
So I'm going to try. It's great to see all of you today. Thanks for being here, and hi to everybody on the call as well. So as Heba and Kim kind of mentioned, they asked me to talk about that third area of value that H2H is providing, that connectedness with the larger sector. Before I get to that, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about what we do, as you can call us HOT, or Humanitarian Openstreetmap Team is our full long name.
We could just take the hot adjective for all of H2H.
That's a good one too. So what we do is we connect and amplify a global network of people taking action locally through data. And that includes organizations like NGOs, government institutions, from national statistics offices to national disaster management agencies, as well as the private sector actors and just individual contributors. So we work with literally hundreds of thousands of individual contributors around the world. And all of these actors are contributing to this really basic challenge that still surprisingly exists in 2022, which is that we still lack a complete, open, digital, up-to-date map of our planet, surprisingly. And so what OpenStreetMap contributors do is they basically take satellite imagery and turn that into digital maps by tracing what they see in those satellite images, the roads, the buildings, key infrastructure like bridges, airports, shelters, health facilities, for example. This global map is not only built by people looking at satellite imagery, it's also mappers walking around, driving around, riding around their communities. And as they're doing this, they're adding key infrastructure and key insights that only exist in people's heads, sometimes at the very local level. So things like community assets, what services are available, as well as perceptions of risks. So we help to mobilize this effort, bring it all together, and produce and share this open data using the OpenStreetMap platform. In other words, our hope is that humanitarian responders, whether they're INGOs or local actors, are going to see something other than just a blank gray background when they open up their map app on their phones or laptops. And we also work really closely with other H2H members. So our fellow members like Map Action, CART-ONG, Reach, and partners like MSF take the data that we produce and turn it into useful insight. And Christina showed you some of the insights that can be created when you layer on additional layer on top of some of the basics that our contributors are working on. So anyway, that's enough about us. To get to H2H's role as a connector, Kim and I had a discussion on this the other day, and I've been thinking about it for the past 2 days. And on the way to Geneva, I was listening to the True Humanitarian podcast. Do any of you listen to that? Has anyone heard of it? Not too many. Okay, so maybe that's one homework for today. Check out True Humanitarian. Really cool podcast with Lars Peter Nissen, who's the director of ACAPS. And although I don't know if it's officially associated with ACAPS, I think it's a side project. So there's this episode called Rogue with Louis Sita, and I highly recommend this episode if you haven't heard it. So Louis talks about supporting the Ukraine response in part by working with a guy called Vlad, who has some medical supplies and a couple of trucks. And Lars Peter helps us to think about Vlad's efforts as what he calls little aid. So it's aid that's very effective and it's very targeted, and it's at the very local level. And so Lars Peter asked us the question, can big aid somehow connect with little aid, and can grassroots initiatives be scaled to become something called Little Big Aid? Maybe that's my contribution, but it was adopted from Lars Peter. So for me, this was the light bulb moment, right? That what if we could scale up these really small, really direct, and really impactful local interventions and connect them? So I was thinking about this. Imagine if we had a network of groups doing things like working to prioritize engagement directly with affected communities ensuring affected people themselves are the ones calling the shots during response. What if we had an organization working to ensure information and resources were available to people in the languages that they prefer? What if we had a global network of people solving local problems by making their communities visible on the world map? What if we had a network of volunteer airline pilots? What if we had logistics and supply chain networks that connect the guys with trucks and ensure aid reaches people in the most vulnerable situations? What if those things existed? So the good news is they all do exist already. And each of those examples that I mentioned are carried out by one or more organizations that are members of H2H. So my point is this, that H2H members are doing this already and working together to be that bridge, right? To connect little aid with big aid and ensuring that impactful interventions happening locally are actually scaled globally and get incorporated into response plans at the country or subnational level. So in the case of data, the data that's created by our community members in one village or one city solving a very specific data gap is then made, that could be done yesterday, and it's then made available to the entire humanitarian community the next morning via humanitarian data exchange and open data sharing. And we have thousands of more people joining those efforts in those communities every month. So I'll wrap up here. So when I last spoke about H2H, it was actually in the same room 2 years ago. And I described H2H as providing the core public goods for response because of a market failure, in my opinion. So to give you an example, all agencies are using digital maps to navigate, to plan logistics, to prioritize aid distribution, but no single company and no single agency is incentivized to create those maps, to maintain them, and to keep them up to date on behalf of the whole sector. So this is a challenge that no one agency is able to take on alone. So you can almost think of our services and the services of many H2H members like basic infrastructure, like roads, right? So everyone uses them, but it's hard for any one individual or agency to actually cover the entire cost of creating and maintaining them. This is exactly what H2H does and what it should be doing. So funding those innovative yet foundational building blocks for response. And the one point I'll add today is H2H is really truly living and embodying the concept of localization of aid. It's providing that backing and the validation and the connection to the broader humanitarian system. So many H2H organizations are ensuring that response starts locally and ends locally, that people and their needs are at the center of response, that aid dollars get to local partners that are doing the hard work, and that local people solving local problems are connected into the wider sector. So the promise that I believe, and I truly believe in this, that H2H has for the sector is this, that it's going to help us get to little big aid. So I'll wrap up there. Thank you.
Nice one. This is getting better and better. Connor, you're gonna have to tell Matthew that he set off this storm of descriptors. That's a beautiful vision. Thank you, Tyler. And I think, as Kim alluded to, the next step for the network and its members is, of course, to ensure that the sector is taking up those services that are available, and that's part of the strategy moving forward, is how do we formalize some of those links and plug into so that OCHA is using the assessments that ACAPS is making and that UNHCR is more regularly using your maps and so on. Our next intervener is the wonderful Volker from the Danish Refugee Council, which has been hosting H2H because it is a hosted entity. Volker also sits on the board with me and a few others. He's the head of effectiveness, knowledge and learning at DRC. And he's been this amazing kind of nexus that connects H2H with the wider DRC organization. A very patient man, I can tell you. And I would love to know from you, Volker, what DRC gets out of hosting H2H.
I believe that's my brief. So nice to see you all here, and it's great to be able to actually talk about that and think about that. And of course, it made me think, because it is important that as a host, you're not just hosting something for the sake of it, you do it for a reason, right? So in terms of H2H, we have heard about the history, but of course it started as a great idea, and I think fairly early on, that was before my time in DSC. DSC was part of that idea and making that idea happen. So, and it was a great idea, and it is a great idea. We heard a lot of examples now of what a great idea it actually is and how it works in practice. It works, right? We have a network structure, we have the system in place, we have the fund set up, which has been immensely useful to help members to really engage, like Meg also pointed out. I think 13 successful activations speak for themselves. And we have definitely a vibrant, energetic team and a very engaged board that has been driving this. So we also need to appreciate that a lot of time was put in by people really passionately believing in this cause. And it's been 3.5 years, I guess, I mean, we're getting into towards 4 years this year. And I mean, we also have to admit it hasn't been without challenges, right? I mean, we had to find purpose for H2H. We had to find our feet together, both from the DSC side and H2H side. And of course, this is also, you know, everybody had a new experience in this, but it took a lot of work, but we came very far. And I think we're now looking into a next stage where we can really take H2H to the next level. So what's in it for DSC? What about that? So H2H, like we heard, is, you know, set out to change the humanitarian system. And of course, as an evidence person, I look at quality, right? So H2H to me is a huge quality add to the humanitarian system. That in itself doesn't necessarily drive change, but of course, we need a lot of quality improvements in the humanitarian system, as we know, and I spend a lot of time being involved in humanitarian evaluations, also at the interagency level, and we consistently see that the quality of the response could be a lot better. And when we don't provide quality in those responses, we do fail the people that actually need the help. So we are a big INGO, a bingo, as some people call it. I sometimes call us a dinosaur. Maybe that's a little bit defeatist, because dinosaurs will at one point, you know, be extinct. I hope we're not. But we are, of course, an organization that is the opposite of nimble, the opposite of like light, agile, specialized of all the H2H members. So why on earth would we host this? Because first reason is we do believe that there needs to be change in the humanitarian system. We do engage in change processes in the system, including the grand bargain. So we do certainly as an organization believe in that. And we also appreciate that we need to change. We can see that. We can see in ourselves a lot of things that we need to do differently, and also seeing the things that are happening from some H2H members more, like especially the accountability side of things, we do see that we need to change a lot of things. So it also is good for us. We embrace change, but we also want to support change. So that's one reason. The second is that we are also quite aware as a humanitarian responder, mostly in displacement, is that we cannot do everything ourselves. There's a lot of specialist services that H2H members provide that, of course, will add quality to our responses. And we have been very guilty of not tapping into that as much as possible. And we are very conscious that we also need to ourselves in DSC. We work in about 35, 36 countries at the moment. We also need to use H2H services a lot more. But there is potential, and the potential is there, and we certainly should not try and do these things ourselves. That's why we have H2H members. And then the third reason, we are potentially quite in a useful in-between position as a big INGO. We are somewhere in between. We're not one of the big players. We're not part of the UN system, but we're big enough to partner with them at the strategic level. For example, we also are quite connected in many operations. For example, we are at the moment in 15 humanitarian country teams, so we have a seat at the table. So we have that connection to a certain extent, but at the same time, we are an NGO. We're not a huge corporate NGO. We're kind of, you know, a little bit smaller. So we still have a little bit of that, you know, civil society feeling. We are quite decentralized. We're very, you know, connected on the ground, the countries we work with. So we also feel we have quite a good in-between position to make that bridging a little bit between little 8 and big 8 and H2H actors and the big system. So then finally, I had also promised to say, why do I think it's important for the humanitarian system? And I would like to quote someone that I saw in a meeting this morning. So in the session here, someone said, the change agenda is a crowded marketplace, which I thought was very profound, and I wanted to use that today. So because it's such a crowded marketplace, and we have agreed that H2H is an important change agent in the system, why is it important that something like H2H exists when you have all the small players that could, of course, do their own thing? And yes, the fund is useful, and bringing them together to mobilize them is one factor. But the other thing is, because it's such a crowded marketplace, having the network, having H2H, the secretariat, as a convener, as a broker, as a facilitator, as a structure that gives access to H2H members through a more direct entry point, of course, makes H2H as a network stand out, hopefully in the long run, as the key change agent in the humanitarian system. So I think in that regard, the setup with the network, secretariat, the broker function, facilitation function is extremely helpful for H2H. And I think that's pretty much what I wanted to say. From our perspective, we would like to see H2H a lot noticed and appreciated and taken up by the system, also the traditional system, the ISC structure. And we are, of course, committed to continue supporting that journey. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Before we turn to you, Shauna, which I'm going to do in a minute, I just want to check in and see from what you've heard so far, if you've got questions. Kim can also speak a little bit more in detail about how different stakeholders can engage with the network. But from what you've heard so far, is there anything you're not clear about? Is there anything on your mind that you're wondering? Yes.
So, thanks. Thank you, everybody. It's super interesting. And I've been in the business, you can say, for very long, and I never heard of all these.
Maybe tell us who you are, actually.
Oh, sorry. My name is Aya Schnelson, and I'm with the World Food Program. And right now I'm in the Office of Evaluation, but I have done various functions, and most of them in the field in terms of operational management, ops management, emergency response, what have you, communication. So I'm just wondering how I've been in the business for so long and haven't heard of all these amazing, really amazing little, not little, but projects and initiatives going on. And that's kind of leads to my question, because you were saying we're big, but we're not, you know, big enough for, is this meant for the non-UN bodies? Where is the integration in order to be effective, in order for seeing the results later on? Where does that fit in? Or, you know, because you're talking on the maps and MSF, but, you know, we have a whole unit that designs map. I mean, so where is the integration? Is it planned, or is it on purpose that it's mostly for INGOs and smaller projects?
Very good question. Do you want
Do you want me to jump in?
to?
I think it depends. I think I would guess that most people working in the humanitarian sector know of some of the core organizations. People know about Sphere, they know about ACAPS. These are well-known organizations, and people working in the specific sectors that we cover will know a few more of the organizations that directly speak to their work. So that if you weren't working in those areas, there's no reason why you might know about the organizations in some of the specific speciality in the other areas that are away from your professional area. So I think that that's fine, having that balance. And I think there's also a mix in our membership of those organizations that very much come from typically individuals, professional experts and coalitions that span out of the formal sector and formed new organizations. That's, I would say, one sort of route to the kind of organizations that we have. And the other would be people who brought new ideas, new technologies from outside the sector and then had organizations that were bridging those into the sector. So those would be, for me, maybe others, two of the typical routes how these organizations have come about. In terms of H2H's kind of relevance and role there, I'm a bit ambiguous about this. I've spoken to people in operational agencies who have used services that have been supported by H2H activations but didn't know H2H existed. And I don't really know if that's a problem or not. I mean, if they use the system and they use the service and it's useful and it helps them respond, and they don't know that it was supportive for us. I don't know if that is a problem. It's a problem for us in terms of our visibility and measuring our impact and communicating that. But I'm not sure in terms of the ultimate goal whether it is a problem or not. That's a question I have still.
I mean, in terms of that, I mean, are we planning to integrate a lot of it into the bigger picture? That's what I meant. For example, the monitoring, is it going to be part of the HRP? Is it going to be feeding to it? Is it going to be a parallel function? Like, is there any bigger thoughts?
I think it depends on the member and what their role is. So some of our members are already deploying as part of the NDAC team, so they're already within that. Some of them would already be providing formally services into the HCTs, for example. Others, the new humanitarian, I think would be a good example. Their role is to play a critical role in analysing the system, and to do that you need to be one step away, so you can't be formally part of it. So we need to be able to represent that diversity as well.
That's just what I was going to say. I think in terms when are you purposefully separate? For some, the answer is yes.
Yeah.
And that would be our case. I think, well, ground truths might be a middle ground. But I would also say that in some cases it is, if you take ACAPS, the whole idea of independent needs assessments is a threat to OCHA's model. And at the beginning, OCHA resisted ACAPS for quite some time. So in some cases, it's not that we are purposefully outside the system, but that the system feels threatened by some of these organizations. And even if they are a public good, it is seen as kind of, well, I would argue, those public goods are not in the interest necessarily of the organizational interests or the corporate interests of some of the organizations that are the big super tankers, as we've talked about.
I don't want to go back to the lubrication metaphor, but the tanker one's an interesting one. There's an academic article written by some humanitarians and academics partnering about a year ago, which was looking specifically at H2H as a case study, and that framed it as, is H2H, are we tugboats or torpedoes? So if you say the system is this tanker that's hard to turn, what's the approach to change? Do you want to be the tugboats that you latch on and you very slowly pull it in the direction that you want to go in, or do you want to be a torpedo that goes in and smashes it and tries to totally destruct it? And I think within our membership there are different approaches to that, and probably that's a continuum. I think for us as a network, we very much see it as being the tugboats, being the enablers, but to do that effectively, you also have to be prepared to be critical at some points as well when that's appropriate.
Maybe Tyler, you could just speak to, because I think it's kind of a critical point though. To what extent are UN agencies using your services?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we've definitely gone the tugboat approach, I would say, on our side. So like everything that we're doing is meant to be done in partnership with others. We're providing some of the basic map data that doesn't exist and that nobody has access to. But we work with GIS teams and IMOs at World Food Program, at OCHA, et cetera. We receive requests oftentimes from those officers for data, and we can help task our volunteers to source that data. So what we want to do is actually, we see ourselves almost like a matchmaker. So we're the bridge like between this crazy volunteer community that's out there of thousands of people and the formal sector, and making sure that needs for data are matched up with the supply of data. So it's kind of like matching the demand and supply.
Super interesting, because I can't remember which crisis it was, but when the whole concept of open source mapping first emerged, like the UN didn't know what to do with it. So there's all this information coming that they actually needed, but they didn't know how to translate it into their systems. And so to have that kind of bridge becomes really interesting. Sorry, you wanted to jump?
Yeah, just a quick one, because I was also trying to make that connection a little bit. There's two things, like of course there's a lot of members that are very much providing services to the big UN organizations. But I think the thing that we feel we need to develop more, I believe, also in the conversations we have, is H2H as a whole. We've seen a few examples of like combination of H2H members, and of course that's the advantage of having an organized network, and that's where the fund comes in, to be able to facilitate, almost like you can come and say, oh yeah, but can we pick a couple of things that work together? And with the fund, they can be mobilized fairly quickly, and you can get going. And then, of course, it can become something bigger and a partnership that goes beyond that. But it's that entry point, that brokering function, that facilitation that we really need to connect, I think, better to bigger clients, which I think that's the point also that you make, is not quite yet so visible that there is that possibility, that opportunity.
But the first step was you coming to the session, and now you can go back to you can tell them all about it.
All eyes on the track. No, but yeah, and that would be for having greater impact, of course. It's important at the end.
Yeah.
The tank is not likely to be overturned.
No. The dinosaurs are not going to be extinct.
Christina, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I said I wasn't going to speak too much about the impact of our sort of specific data. And I think part of the reason for that is also that I'm not entirely sure whether we are the tugboat or the torpedo. And in particular, in relation to this data on attacks on healthcare. And I don't know how many of you would use what the WHO sort of puts out there. But for example, they do not give the geographic location. So you cannot do maps showing where in the country it happens. So the fact that we're doing that with map action is quite subversive. And the other element to say on that is that for this year, if you will look at the Protection of Civilians report, it will cite our data on that, which is something which we've given to their sort of drafting team for a number of reasons. But it's, yeah, so it can be quite complicated of how to deal with systems, and we are nimble and agile. So I think strategies also sort of change depending who your interlocutor is within a particular organization. And I think the strategies can also change as a result, because we're interested not in creating our own glory, if you like, but achieving an end result. And that means how you operate may need to change depending on the circumstances. That maybe was slightly, yeah.
Subversive added to the list.
Yeah.
Other questions or reactions? Yes, at the back.
My name is Lars. I'm with a social enterprise startup. Just wanted to know more about the membership and the private sector are also included within that.
You put your finger on a previously controversial, now resolved matter. Hopefully tomorrow resolved.
To date, private organisations haven't been able to join the network, but one of the things that I'm proposing to the AGM tomorrow is that we change that. And I think that the reason that's important is because there's a much broader range of types of incorporation, whether that's social enterprises, B corporations, community interest companies, what it depends on the jurisdiction you're in, where organisations are choosing different business models to support their work. And I think that we need to recognise that in the network. What I think we can't compromise while doing that goes back to the humanitarian principles and making sure that where organisations are looking to engage with the humanitarian sector, they're able to make a strong case for how they're doing that in a principled way, whatever their legal status is. So hopefully we'll be able to move forward from that tomorrow, but that's where we're at in the direction I hope we're moving.
What's interesting is that what you have resonates with us as a social tech enterprise in terms of the impartiality and making an impact and making a change within the sector itself by using digital technology to do that. So part of the solution, but also trying to share that with the wider community as well for that change to happen. But yeah, thanks for the answer.
Sorry, what's it called? What's your social enterprise called?
Adonic. We had Adonic.
Okay.
We had a session last week, Monday, for blockchain for goods. That's part of the HNPW program. So that's what it is.
Yeah, and actually, I hadn't really thought of it, but H2H could also be playing a role in brokering the relationship between a lot of these private companies and the system, because that's also a kind of space in which they don't know how to interact with one another or speak to each other.
Yeah, if I may to add on this point, I'm Ksenia, Risk and Compliance Officer, so I feel that I need to add here. So it will be interesting to hear how this issue will be addressed tomorrow at the general meeting. But I would like to add another layer, because there are two possibilities to become an H2H member and access the fund. And it will be good if it will be solved tomorrow that private enterprises can become a member. However, there is a second layer, donor compliance rules, and there is still a limitation from the donor level whether we can open the fund to private enterprises. And it's not within our hands. It's also something to discuss, but also worth keeping in mind.
so that there is like two layers, being an H2H member and being an H2H member with access to the fund.
Well, with that transition, I'm referring to you. So Shana Kandola is also with the UK's Foreign FCDO, Commonwealth Development Office. Goodness.
Commonwealth Development Office. It's a bit
Thank
of a
you.
mouthful.
And also on the Conflict Humanitarian and Security team. And since we couldn't have Matthew in person, we are very lucky to have you here. So maybe you could speak a bit from a donor perspective on some of these questions also. I know that's putting you on the spot a little bit, but it'd be interesting to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. So I might start by just saying thank you, first of all, to all the members. I think from a civil servant perspective, we can often seem a little bit kind of trussed up behind our desks in kind of Whitehall and not really out there. So I think it's been really kind of amazing to hear from the members what H2H actually means to you and practically what they're doing on the ground and how that works from a member's perspective. So yes, so thank you very much for all of that. Perhaps I'll come to some of these questions at the end, but I think I might just quickly introduce one of my colleagues who are on the line. We wanted to bring a bigger kind of delegation, but my colleague Martin Hopper is also on the line, who does programs for the FCDO as well. But next year we're hoping to bring a bit more people in person. So I think I kind of just want to build on what Matt said. He spoke about the kind of history of the H2H network and the FCDO's involvement. But I want to kind of speak a little bit more about why we fund H2H and why we were interested in them as a donor. If there are any other potential donors in the room, I'm not sure if there are, but here's my sales pitch. So for context, H2H is one of 5 partners of our Humanitarian Global Services Programme, which is also known as HUGS. And HUGS started in 2018 with the ultimate aim to fund enabling organisations and ultimately improve humanitarian responses and push for humanitarian reform. So the first thing I'm going to speak about briefly is the kind of challenge that we have as donors with funding small organisations. So as part of our humanitarian framework, we are committing to humanitarian reform. And yes, part of that is core funding to UN agencies, but we were also keen to be a little bit more innovative and a little bit more inclusive in how we did that. So in that way, we wanted to engage a range of small, diverse, niche actors, bring them into the conversation and gain new approaches, new perspectives on things like localization, on things like accountability. But that was a challenge for us. So setting up kind of however many 30 small grants, I mean, the resources required, the administration, the logistics, I mean, the paperwork would just be excruciating. So this for us was where H2H came in. And for the first time for the FCDO, they provided a kind of centralized way for us to reach and fund small organizations as one project in a streamlined and efficient way. So in that way, H2H was the really kind of innovative component to the HUGS program, and that was really important to us. So for instance, the FCDO has, through H2H, been able to reach 27 agencies through 64 projects since 2019. I hope someone will correct me if that's wrong. Yeah, right, okay, good. And ultimately, we would not have been able to do that without H2H, without the DRC, facilitating that spend, managing the downstream partners, the due diligence. And even if we were able to fund them, I don't think we would have been able to get the funds out that quickly to enable a fast response in the early kind of days, hours of a crisis, when actually is really important and almost the most vital. Second thing I want to speak about is a little bit about reform and policy. So we love some good old policy as civil servants. So without repeating too much what anybody else has said, H2H is a platform for collaboration amongst members, and through activation of the fund, they produce this kind of strategic package of services that are right for that crisis and that are kind of greater than the sum of the parts. So there are a lot of things there that are really important and really attractive to us. One of them is that collaboration on key issues to bring together these new approaches, new ideas that I've previously spoken about. Another thing is that diversity and that inclusion of kind of technical key skills. And finally, it's that kind of rapidity, that agility, that flexibility, that's really important to us as well. And kind of taken all together, I know that was a lot of words, but we were really keen to support this, and we were looking for a good and better way to do that. And ultimately, taken together, we feel that provides a better humanitarian response. And more than that, it was an alternative to what is quite a centralised and UN-led system. It provided a bit of healthy challenge and a counterbalance to that system. And therefore, we were able to really support our humanitarian reform policy and our grand bargain commitments through H2H, and by doing that in this way. So finally, I just wanted to kind of throw out there a little bit of kind of food for thought about H2H going forward. We're really excited about its future. As Matt said, it's grown massively within a very short space of time. So the FCDO has 3 pillars to our humanitarian framework: prioritise greatest need, protect people and access, and prevent and prepare for crises. We think H2H does a particularly good job at the prioritisation aspect, and what we're keen to do is delve into a little bit more of that prevention and protection aspects as well. And we're really keen to hear from the network and engage with the network about how the network can do that more, how we as a donor can best support them to do that. Second thing we're interested in as well is a bit more work on security and access for those key humanitarian groups on the ground. And these questions that I'm posing all speak to the kind of Ukraine humanitarian crisis, as we all know. But again, we're really kind of keen to engage the network on what that means to them and how we can support them. And finally, as Matt mentioned, really keen to see what a multi-donor H2H looks like going forward, how we can work with other donors, how that that connection can be made. I think I'll leave it there. I hope that gives a bit of an overview of why we fund H2H. The HUGS programme I mentioned at the beginning is just coming to an end, and we are designing its follow-on programme, which is called the Humanitarian Enablers Programme, or HEP. We love an acronym, don't we? If anybody is interested in more information about what H2H is to us as a donor, and as for a long time the only donor, please do reach out. I'm happy to share annual reporting, reviews, donor perspective, and happy to have a chat. So do reach out to that. Heather, you mentioned some questions to answer. I have to admit, I've forgotten what they are.
I will remind you. That is one thing I'm good at doing. And to just say that if you do want to follow up with Shauna on any of this, we will be having a small reception in the lead up to the big reception right after this session. So do stick around and we can continue the conversation. I think the question was around due diligence and the challenges with a fund that is trying to be nimble and agile, and then a donor that has really heavy requirements and that may, for instance, not be able to embrace private sector actors, even if that's the direction the network wants to go. So talk to us a little bit about, I suppose, how as a donor you're thinking about some of those compliance requirements and then softening them possibly.
Yeah, I think it is, you know, with big organisations like the FCDO is, it can seem quite heavy on the paperwork, heavy on compliance issues. I think for us, yes, there's probably a way to go in making that process easier to access, more open and a bit more light touch. I think there are kind of conversations ongoing internally about how we do that, how we can make these long processes quicker, giving delegated authority further down the chain. So these, due diligence, so these reporting, so this agreement doesn't have to go so far up so many levels, so that we can react quicker, fund quicker, get more people on board and be a bit more flexible and agile in that way, which isn't something that we're necessarily ordinarily very good at, which is why we have H2H. But yes, it is a bit more of a challenge for us. There are quite a lot of layers, and I think it's something for us to think more about, have more conversations on. But again, that's why we like having H2H on board, because they give us a bit of flexibility and help take some of that burden away from us a little bit.
Now you know why I said that Volker was a patient man, because he's the one who has to translate that due diligence into what is meant to be a very agile operation. Thank you so much, and that's really helpful. And I think also helpful for us as members to hear some of the areas where we can support some of what FCDO is trying to do and I think I just jotted down the protect people and access and prevent and prepare for crises. I would argue that's a lot of members are very well positioned to work on some of those areas. So that's a conversation I think we should definitely have moving forward. We've got about 10 minutes. If anyone's got questions, comments, reactions, be curious to hear views of someone who is thinking of becoming a member after all of this, not to put you on the spot either. Yeah, the floor is open.
I think it's really from a, coming from somewhat outside of the humanitarian sector and trying to start an organization very similar to what's going on. Immediately, there's like a lot of kinship and a lot of things I've been thinking in isolation that have been kind of said out loud and are really kind of reinforcing that thing. So just in terms of kind of a community aspect is really strong. I think my question slightly selfishly would be, what can organizations do to present themselves as best case, present themselves well to H2H? What can we do to, what kind of things do we need to set up, or what kind of things we need to have in place, or what is H2H looking for, and how can we position oneself the best fit into, look good and to fit into the larger scale?
I think that's for you.
Yeah,
Sorry.
no, it's a great question. I think the key thing, which is not always clear, I think, is that you have to be an H2H type organization, because we get smaller operational actors that are directly implementing that aren't working in that kind of H2H mode, and we don't have an ambition to grow to broaden ourselves to do that. So I think being that H2H actor and demonstrating that is the most important thing. And beyond that, it's about showing how already the work is linked to the sector. It's what inroads are already there to the broader sector, as well as what partnerships are there, particularly with other H2H members. And I think there's a balance there that we need to strike between engaging with organisations that can do that have some track record and have some expertise, but also not raising the barriers too high so that we become a closed shop. And that's something that we're really conscious of, trying to get that balance right, both to try and to a certain level maintain a quality of the services that the members are providing, but also in terms of us being very small. If we grow the membership very quickly, I don't think we'll be able to provide a valuable service to them, and that will be frustrating for everyone. So the striking that balance is something that we're thinking hard about. Yeah.
Had a question right next door.
Yeah. Sorry, excuse me. Thank you. Firstly, thank you for organising this. I've sort of really understood the theory of H2H, the B2B model, but it's been brilliant hearing all the case studies. It's been really illuminating, and I think quite inspiring to hear the real examples. So still your comms team challenge you to capture that, because that really helps to communicate what it is and what it does. My question, sorry, Kim, is you're 6 months in, and also Heba, and we've, I guess, heard about having a niche. You've carved up a niche and you've proven the value. what's next? What's the, I guess, I know you're going to 6 months, a bit unfair, but 5 years from here, what will the H2H look like, and what do you hope it will be doing?
Yeah, I think for me, there's some quite kind of prosaic stuff on the governance and getting the kind of some of those structures strengthened and having a pathway to have a legal entity for H2H. I don't think we have a desire to spin off from DRC, but having something that can house that membership, can house that community, I think is important. And I think naturally, inevitably, the having the fund has been a huge asset for H2H, but it also perhaps means that some of those community elements have been a bit neglected, I think. So like engaging in, as I said at the beginning, developing some specific communities of practice of areas of work to concern to the membership to sort of really build that H2H community is something that I'm really concerned about, alongside also strengthening the fund and doing some of the broadening out. So far, the focus of the fund has primarily been on sudden onset emergencies and spikes in protracted crisis. And I think we don't want to broaden it too much, but broadening it out to slightly wider range of crises types and different points in the humanitarian program cycle. I think there's definitely a strong case to say that our member services would have a lot of value there. We want to explore that in more preparatory or anticipatory type scenarios, for example, would be one issue. And I think, yeah, it's really hard, and it's something that everyone struggles with, but we're not good at the moment at measuring the impact of the services and understanding how they're getting to and being used by the wider system. We get good feedback. We've just done a synthesis of the evidence that the members have generated over the last few years. I mean, it's the really big actors really struggle with this, so it's not a surprise that the smaller ones do too. So I think whilst being pragmatic, there's more we can do there, I think, for the next few years to strengthen that on behalf of the membership.
And I'll just add, we've talked about it a little bit. I would like to see the network be better known for exactly the reasons that our friend from WFP raised, that there's a greater uptake in the services. Again, I think we're producing really high quality stuff, and it's the more that can actually be reaching into the inroads where relevant, the better. We've talked a lot about localization in the sector and also within the context of H2H and the board. And I think for us, what that means is ensuring that the services can easily be available to local actors as well, which I think can be super transformative. If you give a local NGO in Burkina Faso access to high quality maps or data or translated articles about their community, you're changing the power dynamics right there. So a focus on how we make the services accessible to the wider community, but with a real emphasis on local actors is one direction. And then we've talked already about wanting to diversify the donor pool. And I think the last piece is around the community, really ensuring that there's a meaning to being a member and having a thriving, engaged membership community. And there are certainly pockets of it that are very engaged at the moment, but how do we do that across the board?
Yeah, but could I just add a couple of thoughts to what you're saying about local actors? I mean, in our case, we're viewing ourselves not as providers to local actors, but rather the other way around, that actually local actors are the ones providing us valuable data that we're passing on to the wider sector. So I'd also wonder, what are the thoughts about, like, how do we bring in more organizations headquartered outside of the US and Europe into the membership? And how do we also take that point of view where we're not just service providers to locally based organizations, but they're actually the ones that are part of the membership and like actually contributing to this.
That frankly comes back to some of the due diligence stuff, because it will be very hard for some local organizations to jump through the hoops that are imposed by, in this case, the donor and to some extent also the host agency. And so those are some of the questions we're grappling with. But you may want to add something. But I think the other piece of it for me is more broadly, when we talk about humanitarian change and who holds the power and all the rest of it, there has been talk of how do you, right now you get the local NGO to be subcontracted by the international NGO, and how do you flip that model where the local NGO is then contracting the services it needs to be able to deliver the goods. And so I actually think the flip side is a very interesting model that is completely untapped at the moment. That's not to say though that the way you're doing it is also very, it's changing the power dynamic in a different way. but I don't know if you'll have something more to say about local
No,
membership.
the localization thing, I think, is going to be one of the most difficult things for us. You know, it's a great part of the H2H story that emerged from the WHS and from that community of like-minded organizations, but we also know the WHS was not an entirely inclusive process. There were lots of actors that are important in the system that weren't as included as they might have been, and then coming out of it, it has been the localization part of the grand bargain that's been one of the hardest ones to make progress on. So I think we need to do more, but we also we exist within that context and face some of the same constraints, both in terms of if we extend the membership to lots of local organisations that then aren't able to pass our due diligence, I think that's going to be a bad outcome for both us and them. But I think we can do more. So are there targeted ways that we can bring in local actors and do some capacity development to help them be able to do that within the bounds of the resources that we have? Are there partnerships that our memberships already have with local actors? At the moment, we're not able to subgrant to them. Could that be something that we could change in our conversations with donors? So I think this is going to be one of the really difficult things, and I'm conscious of over-promising that we're going to be able to really localise when we're somehow, you know, bound by some of the constraints that others are facing. But I'm really open to ideas there and to have that conversation too.
So a few hands. So I'll come to you in turn. Just quickly to say, I think what Ksenia referred to earlier as well as, you know, there may well be different forms of membership. So there might be some form down the road of membership that isn't necessarily tied to the fund and all the due diligence that comes with that, but that can also provide value for those local actors in a different way. I saw a hand at the back, and then I'll come to you, Max, and then to Christina. Yeah. Yes, you.
Thanks a lot. So it's really great. I mean, the work of the network and the organisation is fantastic, and it's great that the UK is funding and supporting. But at the same time, the UK is also funding much less humanitarian responses and humanitarian needs overall. I mean, a simple statement of fact, but I wonder for H2H Network, I mean, how much is this efficiency argument a risk of being instrumentalized in that giving less aid kind of narrative? And is there is there a dialogue or advocacy component to your role in terms of actually pushing back on donors? And I hope it's not only one donor, because it should be more than one that's contributing, but also saying efficiency is good, but efficiency should get us further, not help us do more with less, because that was, again, one of those challenges of the WHS. That narrative got very twisted at the time, I think, and you know, we need to be pushing hard as the NGO community. I represent an NGO network. We need to be pushing hard and saying it's not about less money, doing more with less money. It's about doing more with the same amount or more money.
Yeah. It's a great question. I think I would say a couple of things. The fund has been a huge part of H2H's journey over the last few years. But if all we focus is on the fund and not on the community and not on the engagement, we're not going to be able to add value in a consistent way. And I think if we look at the kind of marketplace for those services, if we don't have that, there's a good chance we could be outcompeted by professional services firms who could do it more efficiently, who aren't interested so much in the community element. So we have to make sure that we are adding value over and above the fund. But the fund itself, the amounts of money we're talking about are a drop in the ocean of the overall humanitarian response. So I don't think it's about efficiency of the wider response per se. It's about enabling a better quality and a greater impact for that response. So it is that complementary picture. So I don't see I don't think it's that these kind of services can grow exponentially at the expense of core funding to other types of organisation. It has to have that complementarity as well. But that's a conversation that we're happy to have a part in. Yeah.
Yeah, do you want to respond quickly as well?
Yeah, I might, just to add on that, funding has been cut across many spheres, including humanitarian. I think for us, as I raised before, doing more with less isn't practical, isn't possible. Sometimes it is, but certainly in the majority of circumstances. I think for us, something really key is prioritization. Where are we putting our limited resources and making smart decisions about that is really, really key. And I think we made a smart decision to put some of our resources in the H2H network. And the H2H network allows us to make more smart decisions because they have a lot of members who are producing data analytics and a whole host of other services which help us to see where our resources are best placed, where do we need to direct our funding to, where is the need the greatest. So it's kind of a bit of a chain reaction here, prioritization with potentially less resources rather than doing more with less, is I think how we'll need to move forward.
But at least one donor has heard the message. I'm conscious of time, so we'll just take 2 more comments and then we can continue the conversation over wine. Max.
Well, I mean, yeah, you mentioned, sorry, I'm Max, I'm from Response Innovation Lab, and yeah, you mentioned sort of due diligence as being one of the major barriers to, deeper engagement or more complete engagement with local actors. And at the same time, you're also saying that you're trying to diversify your funding base. Is that one of the criteria? Are you looking to actively find more sort of flexible, conditions? Is that part of your scoping for additional funding? Yeah, is that part of the plan, so to speak, to loosen the?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've heard, there's the FCDO, there's a range of reasons why they're engaging, but solving that problem for them is clearly one of the things that we offer them. For different donors, the value proposition has to be different. Not all of them face those same constraints, and we definitely look at both other bilateral donors who might be more open to a wider range of funding, or indeed private foundation funding, which doesn't face the same sort of constraints, but we have to offer them something slightly different there. I'd be really interested to see how we can make those different sources of funding complementary.
Christina, you wanted to...
Yeah, I don't know whether this is sort of a good note to end on or too much detail, but I just wanted to sort of share a little bit more sort of the process of how it sort of, maybe I'll stand up that people can hear me, of sort of how the H2H sort of process works, because we've just heard about OpenStreetMap maps using local actors to put in the information. So what I didn't say when I talked to you is how do we actually get the geolocation of the data for these maps? Well, that's where it comes from. And without getting into the technical things, we've underlined that in our system. We're using the data that comes from Open Humanitarian Street Maps to give the incidents a very clear location on a map. So we've also turned this into data that's on the Humanitarian Data Exchange. And what we're trying for the first time with a report we're doing on these things is we are collaborating with the International Rescue Committee and Médecins du Monde, who are using their advocacy strategy to bring local actors into using the data